My name is Lena Hartman, 42 years old, and the day I decided to sell my late husband's garage, I expected maybe a few dusty power tools, some childhood trophies, a forgotten fishing pole or two. I didn't expect the feeling of my entire past collapsing in my chest. I didn't expect to find a box with my name on it, or the folders stacked beside it with titles like Property Before Marriage, Lena, Surveillance, and worst of all, one labeled, In Case She Ever Tries to Leave. That last one hit like a blade buried in my spine. The handwriting was unmistakably his, meticulous, cold, calculated. The same man who used to kiss my forehead every morning had filed me away like a threat. And the sickest part? I knew, deep down, this wasn't spontaneous. He'd been planning, archiving, documenting. This was never about love. It was about control, and he was playing the long game long before the cancer took him. I stood there in that stale, echoing space, half lit by the flickering fluorescent tube overhead, and everything in me went still. His brother, who had reluctantly handed me the keys an hour earlier, had muttered something I should have paid attention to. Some things are better left locked, he'd said, almost under his breath. But there was a smugness behind it, like he already knew what I'd find. That garage wasn't just a room. It was a vault of manipulation, and I was about to unseal every secret my husband thought he'd die with. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing. My hands shook as I opened the first box. Inside were printed emails, dozens of them, between me and friends, some dating back 10 years. Some were intimate. Some were things I barely remembered saying. Private jokes, heartfelt messages, even arguments I'd forgotten. He had them all. Annotated. Highlighted. One of them had emotional instability scribbled in the margin. It wasn't just disturbing, it was surgical. This wasn't the work of a paranoid man. This was the work of someone preparing for war. My marriage hadn't been a partnership. It had been a surveillance operation. And the real horror wasn't what he left behind. It was what it revealed about everything that came before. Suddenly, every strange pause during a conversation, every time he changed a password or hesitated to let me see a financial statement, it all clicked into place like the final piece of a jigsaw puzzle I didn't know I was solving. He had spent a decade building a case against me. A man I nursed through chemo. A man I held at 3 a.m. when he cried from the pain. A man who whispered, "I don't deserve you," right before he passed out in my arms. And now I saw the truth. He didn't mean he didn't deserve my love. He meant he didn't deserve to get caught. I knelt beside the pile, not even feeling the cold concrete beneath my knees, and opened the next folder. It was full of photos. Me at work, me on my lunch break, me walking through the grocery store. None of them were romantic or sentimental. They were surveillance photos, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. Some even had timestamps and little sticky notes like, Wednesday, 2:10 p.m., suspicious? Suspicious of what? I wasn't cheating. I wasn't stealing. I was surviving. Most days, I barely had the energy to make dinner, let alone orchestrate some elaborate deception. But to him, my independence was a threat. My routine, my privacy, my friendships, they were liabilities in his narrative. And this wasn't just obsession. It was strategy. He had mapped me out like a project. And the sickest part was, I think he enjoyed it. If you've ever had the rug pulled out from under you after years of telling yourself it was just a rough patch, or if you've ever looked back at the little red flags you ignored and wanted to rip them out of the ground with your bare hands, subscribe. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about betrayal. It's about rebirth. What happens when you take everything a man used to break you and build something stronger from the rubble? What I found in that garage didn't destroy me. It introduced me to the version of myself I had buried under his lies. And she was done playing the quiet wife. As I stood up, my eyes landed on one last envelope. It wasn't labeled, just sealed with a paperclip. I opened it, half expecting to find some legal document, but inside was a letter. Not from him, from her. Her name was Eva, and I had no idea who she was. But apparently, she'd known about me for years. The letter was written 5 months before he died. "Lena," it began, "you don't know me, but I owe you the truth. He told me you were dangerous, that you were unstable, that you'd try to ruin his reputation if he ever left you. I believed him. I'm sorry, but I found things he hid from both of us. And if you're reading this, I guess he's gone. I hope you find what he took from you. I hope you take it back." I dropped the letter. My hands were shaking for a different reason now. Not fear, not sadness, clarity. That rare, slicing clarity that arrives when all the illusions burn away and only the truth remains. He had been playing both of us. Maybe more. Maybe there were others. But one thing was clear. He didn't leave behind a legacy. He left behind a map, and I was about to follow it, not because I wanted revenge in the way he feared, but because I deserved to reclaim the version of myself he'd tried to erase. The woman who once laughed without hesitation. The woman who used to write poetry. The woman who had dreams beyond being someone's wife. She was still in there, beneath the ashes. And I remembered, vividly, the first time he made me doubt myself. It wasn't some grand betrayal. It was a dinner party. I told a story, and he interrupted, laughing. "That's not how it happened. Don't embarrass yourself." Everyone chuckled. I laughed too. But something small and vital inside me folded that night. And now, all these years later, standing in that garage full of secrets and silence, I felt that part of me stretch its wings again. Because this wasn't the end. It was the reckoning. And he wouldn't get to write the last chapter. Before the garage, before the folder, before the manila envelope that cracked open a decade of buried truths, there was just me. Lena Hartman, a woman with a morning routine, a grocery list, and a worn-out dream she folded into her apron pocket between laundry cycles. I taught high school English in our small town just outside Lexington. Nothing glamorous, but I loved it. There was something sacred in watching shy teenagers fall in love with words, even if only for a semester. I'd come home with chalk dust on my hands and quotes scribbled in my planner, most of them not mine. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. That was Joan Didion, and I used to believe it with my whole heart. But now, I wonder if we also tell ourselves stories to survive what we're too afraid to name. My life wasn't extraordinary, but it was full. Quietly, richly full. I planted lavender in the front yard every spring. I called my sister every Sunday, even when she forgot it was our time. I made soup from scratch and kept handwritten recipe cards, just like my mother did before she passed. There was a rhythm to my days that felt like peace, even if it was tinged with longing. I'd wanted children, but after the second miscarriage, Jack said maybe it was a sign. He didn't say it cruelly, just conclusively, like the case was closed. He kissed my temple and said, "At least we have each other." And I nodded like that was enough. I wanted it to be enough. So I buried that ache somewhere deep, where it wouldn't interrupt dinner conversations or late-night TV marathons with a glass of red wine. At school, I was the teacher who remembered birthdays, who kept granola bars in her drawer for students who didn't eat breakfast. I wasn't flashy or loud. I wasn't the one invited to every staff party. But I was steady, reliable. Miss Hartman with the soft voice and firm rules. The one who lent a book and remembered to ask what you thought of it 2 weeks later. But quiet strength doesn't earn applause. It gets mistaken for simplicity, for predictability, for invisibility. And maybe that's what he counted on. Jack was charming in a way that aged well. The kind of man who wore cologne just subtle enough to notice and always knew the right thing to say at a funeral. He was a financial advisor, good at explaining complicated things in plain language. People trusted him. He used words like stability and foresight and long-term vision the way some men used fists. And when I met him, I mistook all that certainty for safety. I'd just come out of a relationship that was the opposite. Wild, erratic, passionate in all the wrong ways. Jack felt like the calm after a storm. I didn't realize until much later that the calm was just a deeper kind of weather. Our early years were easy, or maybe I was too eager to believe they were. He liked that I had a career but didn't chase promotions. He told me once, "You're the kind of woman who doesn't need a spotlight to shine." And I wrote it down in a journal like it was a love poem. Now I read it like a red flag in cursive. There were signs, of course. Small things. He never liked when I went out without telling him. Not angrily. He'd just ask little questions. "Who was there? You didn't mention that before. I thought we agreed on saving money this month." He had a way of layering concern over control, like sugar over vinegar. And I, like so many women raised to keep the peace, smiled through it, explained myself, shrunk a little. There was one night that sticks out now, though at the time, I brushed it off. I'd stayed late at school to help with the spring play. I was only supervising backstage, nothing important. But the students were nervous and needed encouragement. When I got home, Jack was waiting on the porch. He wasn't angry. That would have been easier. He was disappointed. He held up the casserole I'd promised to make for his client dinner and said, "I guess I should have called your boss and asked permission first." I apologized, profusely, and I meant it. That's what haunts me now. I actually felt sorry for disappointing him. I made a double batch the next night and he said, "See? We're a good team." I didn't realize then that teams don't operate on fear and guilt. They operate on mutual respect. But I didn't have the language for that yet. Jack's brother, Dean, was another subtle weight in our marriage. The kind of man who never outright insulted me but managed to diminish me with every interaction. He'd pat my shoulder and say things like, "Don't let this one get away, Jack. She's housebroken." Or, "Lena's a sweetheart. Not much of a firecracker, but she'll keep you warm." I'd laugh because that's what you're supposed to do when men condescend without cursing. I'd laugh because calling it out felt like overreacting, and Jack never defended me. He'd just roll his eyes and say, "Dean's an idiot." But he kept inviting him over, kept asking him for advice, kept reinforcing the hierarchy, where Dean was the bulldozer and I was the garden to be managed. We tried for kids for 4 years, quietly. I didn't want to make it a performance. After the second miscarriage, I stopped telling anyone about the attempts. Jack said we shouldn't broadcast our failures, and something in me agreed. I taught teenagers during the day and came home to ovulation calendars and half-hearted optimism at night. When we finally gave up, he said, "It's probably for the best. You're too sensitive." Sensitive, that word. It was the blade he kept sharp in his pocket. He used it when I cried at commercials, when I worried about my students, when I questioned his coldness. "You're too sensitive." As if that made my pain imaginary. As if I should apologize for feeling things deeply. Still, I believed in our life. I believed in the version of us we presented at dinner parties. I believed the weight I carried was normal, that everyone compromises. I convinced myself that what we had was stability, and I wore it like a medal while quietly bleeding inside. I took care of him when the diagnosis came. Of course I did. I managed his meds, his appointments, his moods. He never said thank you, not once. But he'd tell people, "Lena's amazing. She's holding down the fort." And I held onto those words like they were love letters. Because I was so starved for affection that even public praise felt intimate. When he died, I didn't cry at the funeral. Not because I wasn't sad, but because I was too numb to locate the sadness. It was like grief was waiting in line behind exhaustion, resentment, and some unnamed emotion I hadn't yet unpacked. Everyone said, "You were such a devoted wife," and I smiled. Of course I did. I didn't know the truth then. I didn't know the depth of the betrayal sitting in that garage like a ticking time bomb with my name on it. I spent months clearing out his things, closet by closet, drawer by drawer. He had always kept the garage separate. "It's just man stuff," he'd say. "You wouldn't be interested." And I wasn't. I had no reason to be. I had no idea that inside that space, he was curating a history I hadn't consented to, a narrative where I was the villain, or the backup plan, or the liability. I had no idea that while I was nursing him to sleep, he was building a legal landmine just in case I ever dared to reclaim my voice. Looking back now, I see it all. The compliments that were really cages. The protection that was really surveillance. The love that was really possession. And I wonder how many women like me exist in quiet homes with clean kitchens, convincing themselves they are lucky, when in fact they are being erased in real time. I think about how many small slights we swallow to keep the peace, how many red flags we fold into origami excuses. And I think about the moment I opened that garage door and saw my name on that box. That moment rewrote everything that came before. But to understand the betrayal, you have to understand the silence that made it possible. And now, I was done being silent. It happened at a dinner party. Isn't that always where masks slip, between sips of wine and clinks of cutlery, where people perform their best selves under soft lighting? It was spring, the kind that still carries a chill in the evening, and Jack had insisted we host his colleagues and 2 potential clients. I remember fussing over the table setting, folding the linen napkins into triangles the way his mother taught me years ago. Jack was unusually tense that day, short with me in the kitchen. "Don't overcook the lamb this time," he said, not even looking up from his phone. I told myself he was just nervous about the meeting. He had a way of making every minor detail feel like a make-or-break scenario. And I, like always, absorbed the pressure and converted it into hospitality. The guests arrived promptly at 7. Everyone was dressed the same way people in Jack's world always dressed, like they were auditioning for a promotion, even at dinner. I wore a navy wrap dress that he had complimented once 3 years ago and never again. As I handed out cocktails, I noticed how he lit up when introducing everyone, how he placed his hand firmly on the small of my back as he said, "And this is Lena, the real boss of the house." They all laughed. I smiled. It was a familiar script. I'd played that supporting role for years. But that night, something shifted. Not because I was suddenly stronger or wiser, but because he went too far. We were midway through dinner when one of the clients asked Jack about our plans for the summer. I started to answer, mentioning I'd wanted to visit New England, take a few days along the coast. But Jack interrupted. "She has these little dreams," he said, slicing into his lamb. "Lena's great at planning imaginary vacations, keeps her inspired." He smiled, like it was a compliment. The guests chuckled politely. I felt my ears burn. I tried to laugh it off, but my fork hovered mid-air. Little dreams. Imaginary. As if my hopes were childish, decorative, not to be taken seriously. I was 41 years old, and my husband had just reduced me to a whimsical distraction in front of people I'd served and welcomed into my home. I wanted to leave the table. Instead, I refilled the wine glasses, including his. The conversation moved on, but something in me didn't. Something in me sat right there at that table and didn't forgive him. That was the moment it started to unravel. Not loudly, not obviously, but internally. I began to rewatch every moment of our marriage through that lens. His ability to diminish me so smoothly, so publicly, and still seem like the loving husband. It wasn't just that he didn't respect me. It was that he needed other people not to respect me either. Because as long as I was small, he could remain large. As long as I was quaint, he could be impressive. My ambition, soft as it was a threat to the image he built. The image where he was the achiever and I was the grateful wife. A few weeks later, I found something that made my hands go cold. We were preparing to file taxes. Well, I was. Jack liked to pretend we were a team, but the paperwork always landed on my desk. In sorting through the envelopes, I found a bank statement addressed to a P.O. box I didn't recognize. I opened it. A savings account I didn't know existed. Significant deposits. Thousands. I stared at the numbers, willing them to rearrange themselves into something reasonable. They didn't. I asked him about it that night, calmly, with the statement laid flat on the counter between us. He looked at it, then at me, and said, "That's just a backup fund." In case the market tanks or something happens to us. His voice didn't waver, but his eyes did. I asked why he never mentioned it. He shrugged. Didn't think I needed to. We have shared accounts. This is just contingency. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to wrap myself in that word, contingency, like it was protection. But it wasn't. It was a firewall. Not for us, for him. And suddenly I remembered a conversation we'd had during our first year of marriage, when I asked if we should get a prenup. He laughed and said, "Why would we plan for failure?" I hadn't insisted. I thought it meant we were safe. A month later, I discovered the burner phone. It was under the passenger seat of his car. I was cleaning it because he had a client visiting from out of town, and the car smelled like fast food. I reached beneath the seat for an old receipt and pulled out the phone. My heart told me what it was before my brain caught up. I pressed the power button. It lit up. No password. Just a few recent texts, one from a number saved as Eva. A simple message. "Did you delete everything like we said?" That was the day I started documenting. Not because I was ready for revenge, but because I needed evidence. Proof, for myself, that I wasn't crazy. That the unease that had been growing inside me for years wasn't just paranoia. I copied files, took photos, started saving things to a private cloud. I stopped bringing up concerns, stopped reacting. I let him think I was still asleep inside our marriage while I quietly learned how to wake up. The worst betrayal wasn't the money or the burner phone or even the way he belittled me in front of others. It was the way he made me doubt my own instincts, the gaslighting, the small rewrites of history. He'd say things like, "I never said that," or, "You're misremembering again." He turned my memory into an unreliable narrator. And I, who taught literature and dissected unreliable narrators for a living, couldn't recognize it happening in real time in my own life. There was a night not long after the phone discovery when he called me ungrateful. We were in bed. He had his laptop on his chest, watching a documentary about tech startups. I was reading. I asked if he wanted to plan a trip for our anniversary. He sighed. "Why do you always need more?" he said. "I've given you a good life. You don't even know how good you have it." I closed the book, stared at him. He didn't look up. And that moment, quiet, unremarkable to anyone else, was the final fracture. Because it told me everything. He didn't think of me as a partner. He thought of me as a beneficiary. Someone lucky to be chosen. Someone owed nothing but shelter. When he got sick, I pushed all of it down. I became the nurse, the caregiver, the grief counselor. I bathed him, fed him, held his hand through procedures. I sang to him when he couldn't sleep. I read to him when his eyes failed. I wiped his forehead and whispered, "I'm here," even when I was barely holding myself together. And he, even at the end, never once apologized. Never once said, "Thank you." In his final week, he turned to me and said, "You'll be fine. You're good at being alone." That was his goodbye. A compliment wrapped in cruelty. A final echo of his belief that I was never really someone. Just something. Capable, convenient, replaceable. And so, when I opened the garage after his funeral, when I turned that key and stepped inside the vault of secrets, I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. I just stood there. Because some part of me already knew. The betrayal wasn't a sudden storm. It was erosion. Slow, daily. Barely visible until one day the ground beneath you gives way. But what he didn't anticipate was that the erosion had uncovered something. Not weakness. Not despair. But a core of steel he had spent years trying to sand down. And now it was exposed. Now it was awake. And for the first time in over a decade, I felt like I had something dangerous in my hands. Not a weapon, not even a plan. The truth. And that was enough to start a fire. There's a peculiar kind of power in knowing something no one else knows. In walking into a room and smiling at people who would treat you differently if they understood what you carried inside. After I opened that garage, after I read every page of every folder, I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even cry. I sat on the cold cement floor for nearly 3 hours, rereading everything. The surveillance, the finances, the legal drafts, the timelines. There were checklists of my behaviors, speculative memos about what I might do, how to contain me if I ever became unstable. He'd written contingency plans like I was a hostile acquisition, not his wife. And somehow, I felt stiller than I had in years. That's the moment I stopped reacting and started calculating. The first thing I did was take photos, every single document. Then I placed everything back exactly as I'd found it. I didn't tell his brother Dean. I didn't even tell my sister. I needed time, not to think, but to become someone new quietly, invisibly. The version of me Jack had never anticipated. He'd planned for the emotional woman, the grieving widow, the volatile version of Lena who might lash out and make herself look unstable. He didn't plan for this one. The one who smiled at the bank teller while opening a new safety deposit box under a trust name. The one who hired a lawyer without mentioning Jack's name. The one who read estate law like it was scripture and made her own list, item by item, of everything he never thought she'd understand. I started waking up at 5 a.m. again, not to make breakfast or clean, just to think, to stretch, to reclaim hours of my life that were once consumed by care and apology. I kept going to work, teaching Shakespeare and Baldwin and Woolf, and I started slipping small lessons into my class about gaslighting, voice, and truth. I didn't name Jack. I didn't need to, but I watched as a few of my students, especially the girls, began to sit up straighter. That felt like its own kind of justice. At home, I began the long, quiet process of reclaiming everything that had once belonged to us, but had always in practice belonged to him. I started with the finances. The accounts were mostly in his name, of course, but the trust he left behind was vague, and in my favor. Probably because he never thought I'd question it. He assumed I'd take the monthly payout like a grateful ex-employee and leave it at that. But I had the documents now, the ones that showed the offshore fund he never disclosed, the Shell LLC he used to move money without taxes. I didn't need to confront anyone yet. I just needed to understand it better than he did. So I hired a forensic accountant, a quiet, brilliant woman named Asha, who didn't flinch when I showed her the files. She simply said, "You've got him right where he didn't expect you to be." There was a will, of course. It left most of the visible assets to me, public assets, the kind that say loving husband in an obituary. But the rest? The rest I began tracing through bank statements and email printouts, slowly building a legal map of what I was truly owed. I didn't call it revenge, not yet. I called it justice, inheritance of truth. Dean came by one evening, unannounced, just as the sun was setting. He looked surprised to see me in the garage. I'd gone back in, wearing gloves this time, cataloging everything by box number. I told him I was doing inventory for insurance. He smiled that empty smile and said, "You really don't know when to let things go, do you?" I smiled back, handed him a glass of bourbon, and said, "Only when they're worth forgetting." He didn't know I'd already had my attorney quietly subpoena his phone records. I didn't suspect Dean was just a bystander. His fingerprints were all over Jack's backup plans. He'd been helping him set things up for years, making phone calls, laundering assets through his small business. They thought they were so clever, so untraceable. But arrogance leaves a scent. There was no need to warn him. Letting him think I was still in the dark was far more powerful. I let him ramble that evening about how hard Jack worked, how men sometimes had to make tough decisions to keep things orderly. I just nodded, offered him another drink, and filed the entire conversation in my memory. It would be useful later, like a final puzzle piece held in reserve. Emotionally, I stayed measured. At school, at home, with friends. I was soft-spoken, as always, but something had shifted in my posture. I stopped explaining myself. Stopped shrinking when conversations turned toward finances or relationships. When someone said, "You're handling Jack's passing so gracefully," I'd simply nod. I had stopped looking for comfort in places that couldn't hold it. The grief was still there, yes. But now it was braided with purpose. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. At night, instead of watching TV, I journaled. Not the way I used to, filling pages with apologies and self-doubt, but with clarity, strategy, vision. I made a list called What I Know Now. It included things like, he always picked women who flinched when corrected, and he didn't lie to protect me. He lied to protect the story he told about himself. That list became a manifesto. A quiet declaration that the version of Lena Hartman who accepted humiliation as a form of love was gone. I also began making small legal moves that looked like nothing to the outside world, but were, in reality, tectonic shifts. I updated my own will. I revised the deed on the house. I sold the second property Jack had insisted we keep for future investments and moved the funds into a foundation under my name. The paperwork was tight, airtight. My lawyer, a woman named Simone, used to be a courtroom bulldog before switching to private estate work. She told me, "You're playing this like a grandmaster." I told her, "No, I'm just tired of being underestimated." The most difficult part of this phase wasn't the planning. It was the withholding. Every instinct in me wanted to scream, to publish the files, to call his remaining colleagues and destroy the legacy he left behind. But I didn't. Because this wasn't about noise. It was about timing. The right story told at the right moment doesn't need to shout. It changes the room with a whisper. That's when I realized something else. He didn't just fear losing control. He feared exposure. Jack had spent a lifetime building a persona. Upstanding husband, financial guru, dependable brother, well-loved client. He was meticulous about the image. It was more important than the reality. And I, more than anyone, knew exactly where the cracks were. So I kept moving silently, strategically. I met with a journalist under the guise of discussing women's estate rights. I never mentioned Jack, but I left behind a flash drive. No return address, just a breadcrumb. I reached out to Eva, the woman from the letter I'd found in the garage. It took 3 weeks to track her down. She answered my email with a single line, "I've been waiting for this." When we met, she brought her own folder. Photos, emails, notes from therapy. I didn't need her story to validate mine, but having it made the picture complete. The real turning point didn't happen with a bang. It happened quietly, over coffee with a woman who used to be a stranger, sharing stories that used to make us feel ashamed, and now made us feel powerful. By the time summer rolled around, I had everything I needed. Evidence, support, a plan. But I wasn't rushing, because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who built a life on control is let them believe they still have it, right until the moment they don't. It happened on a Tuesday. A bright one. The kind of day with birdsong and breeze and no hint that something was about to shift. Dean had invited me to lunch. Just to catch up, he'd said, using that oily tone that always made me feel like I'd forgotten my place. We met at a small restaurant downtown, one Jack used to frequent with clients. Dean talked about real estate, mutual funds, his new girlfriend. I listened, smiled when appropriate, stirred my tea with care. Then he leaned in and asked what I planned to do with all that money Jack left behind. There it was. Not even subtle, not even disguised. The hunger behind his grin was animal. I looked him in the eye and said, "I've already put most of it into a foundation, women's legal advocacy." I watched the twitch in his jaw. "We're helping women access legal support when they've been financially controlled in their marriages," I added. His mouth smiled. His eyes didn't. "Seems a bit personal," he said. "It is," I replied, still smiling. "Very personal." That was all I gave him. The appetizer. The silence that follows a warning shot. I left him with the check. The next morning, the first article dropped. A long-form expose in a reputable business journal. No names in the headline, but Jack's were all over the body. How one financial advisor used private marital records to build secret wealth. The piece was careful, thorough. It included screenshots of documents, sanitized but unmistakable to anyone who knew the context. It spoke about financial abuse, about covert manipulation within a marriage, about loopholes in estate law. It never called Jack a monster. It didn't need to. It simply held a mirror to his legacy and let readers decide what they saw. That same afternoon, I received a call from a former client of Jack's. She sounded shaken. "I read the article," she said. "I always thought there was something off. Thank you." That call was the first of many. Over the next week, women from our town, and some from far beyond, reached out with their own stories. Some had been partners. Some had just heard the name. Some had stories about Dean. The ripple had started. Dean called me 3 days later. His voice was no longer smug. It was tight, controlled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he said. I told him I was simply following Jack's example. "Foresight," I said. "Stability, long-term vision." I could hear his breath on the line. "You have no idea what you're playing with." I said, "I think I do. That's why I'm playing it so slowly." Then I hung up. But the real blow hadn't landed yet. That came the next week, when the IRS launched an audit based on documentation submitted anonymously through their whistleblower portal. The records, the ones I found in the garage, the ones Eva confirmed with her own, outlined the offshore accounts, the undeclared earnings, the pass-through entity registered in another state under Dean's name. The audit expanded fast. Then came the subpoenas. Not to me. To Dean. To Jack's old firm. To the holding company that technically still owned the cabin Jack bought 2 years before he died, which turned out to be a luxury condo rented out to clients. All off the books. I never stepped into a courtroom. I never raised my voice. I never posted a single thing online. But every step I'd taken, every appointment, every file, every document handed quietly to someone who knew what to do with it, had been moving toward this moment. The day the men who once called me sensitive now called their lawyers in panic. The day their empire, built on arrogance and secrecy, started to fold under the weight of evidence they never thought would see the light. And yet, none of it compared to the moment that mattered most. That moment didn't involve courts or banks or headlines. It happened in a community center on a Thursday night where we held the first meeting for the foundation I'd established in Jack's name. Women gathered in folding chairs, many holding stories they'd never said aloud. One woman cried before she spoke. Another couldn't even begin. I stood in front of them, not as a victim or a widow, but as a witness. To them, to myself. To what silence can become when it finally chooses itself. But if I had to choose a single moment where the revenge became undeniable, it was the day I sold the house. The house Jack had bought for our future. The house where I lost my pregnancies. Where I folded his laundry and my hope in the same load. Where he installed cameras without asking. Where I whispered apologies into pillows I didn't deserve to sleep on alone. That house sold above asking, and I didn't keep a single dollar of it. Instead, I took the proceeds and divided them between two things: the foundation and a writing retreat on the coast of Maine. I went alone. Rented a cottage with a garden and a view of the ocean. I brought the journals I'd been keeping, the file I'd labeled Truth, and nothing else. No photos, no reminders, just blank pages. The final turn was quiet, as all real revenge should be. It came not from destruction, but from transformation. I didn't become someone new. I returned to who I had been before his voice told me I was too much, too soft, too fragile, too emotional. Before I was managed. I remembered what I used to want: to teach, to write, to build something that mattered. And now, I had. Eva and I stayed in touch. We never talked about Jack anymore, not because we forgave him, but because he had finally become irrelevant. A man once so obsessed with control that he wrote contingency plans for his own wife. And now, just a name in an article, a cautionary tale, a faded signature on paper I no longer needed to reference. The world didn't implode when the truth came out. It adjusted. quietly. Certain people distanced themselves from Dean. Others reached out to me with unexpected apologies. My voice didn't shake when I spoke anymore. My hands didn't fidget under scrutiny. I had walked through a fire that was built to consume me and come out carrying the blueprints. What they never understood was that the most powerful woman in the room is never the one yelling. She's the one listening, remembering, waiting, moving chess pieces while the others play checkers. And by the time they realize the game has changed, it's already over. And so, on the 1-year anniversary of his passing, I didn't light a candle. I didn't visit the grave. I took a walk by the ocean, let the wind knot my hair, and smiled to myself. Not because I'd won, but because I was free, and because somewhere, some woman was opening her own garage door, pulling back the silence, and finally seeing what had always been there. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. They called an emergency meeting at the firm. It wasn't public yet, but the audit had begun to tear holes in the structure. Whispers spread like rot in the foundation. Dean, always so smug, had been summoned by the board. Quietly, discreetly, the way men like him had always operated. But this time, I was invited too. Technically, I was still a major stakeholder. Jack's name was still etched on the building's granite plaque outside, and with his assets being investigated, they had no choice but to acknowledge me. Funny how quickly a widow becomes visible when money's involved. I wore gray, no jewelry, no makeup beyond a swipe of mascara. It wasn't about looking powerful. It was about looking impossible to ignore. I walked into that boardroom the way I used to walk into my classroom after summer break, aware of every eye, every whisper, every assumption being made and already outdated. Dean was there first. He stood when I entered, not out of respect, out of strategy. He gestured to the seat across from him. I didn't sit. Not yet. The partners arrived slowly. 5 men, 2 women, none of whom had ever looked me directly in the eye at social functions unless Jack introduced me. One of the men, Richard, cleared his throat and motioned toward the seat again. Lena, thank you for coming on short notice. I nodded once and sat. Folded my hands. Waited. Dean tried to speak first. Of course he did. But the firm's legal counsel cut him off. We're here to discuss a series of disclosures that have emerged involving Mr. Hartman's estate and past financial activities. Disclosures. That was their word for the house of cards now catching wind. Dean leaned back, performed a dry smile, and said, "Let's not get dramatic. This is all posthumous speculation. My brother kept detailed records, yes. But anyone can twist documentation when the subject can't defend himself. He was trying to get ahead of it, pre-spin, frame the narrative. He didn't know the frame was already cracked. I opened the folder in front of me, slid it across the table without a word. Inside, annotated copies of the financial records, the shell company registrations, and a copy of the burner phone text logs, painstakingly preserved by the cybersecurity expert I'd hired months ago. Richard looked through it, passed it to the others. Dean was quiet now, but his eyes followed every page like they might rewrite themselves mid-air. No one interrupted the silence. That was the thing about silence. It can feel like a weapon when it's earned. When it fills the room with weight instead of weakness. Dean finally reached for the folder. I slid my hand across it before he could. "Not yet," I said. It was the same tone Jack used to use on me when I interrupted. The same tone Dean once used when I asked about a balance sheet. Now it landed like a stone. Dean's hand withdrew slowly. The room stayed still. Then came the first inversion. Richard asked, "Was anyone else involved in setting these structures up?" I turned to Dean, raised my eyebrows. Let the silence draw out until it was uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She's not a professional. She's a schoolteacher who thinks she can read tax code." I smiled softly. "You're right. I'm not a professional." Then I turned to the legal counsel. "Would you mind reviewing item 3 in that binder? The one labeled Consulting Witness, Asha Kamara." She opened the tab. "Ms. Kamara," I added. is a forensic accountant who testified in federal cases regarding fraud and financial abuse. I've been working with her for 8 months. Dean's face turned the shade of cold ash. He opened his mouth again, and I cut him off, gently, but clearly. Dean, don't embarrass yourself. That's what Jack had said to me once, years ago, in front of company. Now the phrase returned like a ghost, but this time it was wearing my voice. He blinked, swallowed. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew. The next hour unfolded like a quiet storm. The documents were reviewed. The lawyer explained the likely outcomes: fines, dissolutions, criminal liability pending the audit's results. But the real moment wasn't legal. It was psychological. When Dean realized that not only had I outmaneuvered him, but that I'd done so without ever raising my voice, without threats, without chaos, just precision, just presence. When it ended, they all stood, one by one, hands shaken, polite nods. I let them leave first. Dean remained seated, eyes on the wall, the folder now lying in front of him like a broken compass. I waited until the room emptied. Then I said what needed to be said. You once told Jack I was housebroken. He flinched but didn't deny it. I used to laugh at that, to keep the peace. But here's what you missed. A woman who learns to live in a house built to contain her. She learns the architecture. She learns where the beams are. She learns how to pull it down without making a sound. He stared at me, small now, the performance stripped away. I didn't gloat. That would have made me like him. I just stood, gathered my folder, and walked toward the door. Just before I left, I turned back and said, Jack always thought I was lucky to be married to him. I paused. Turns out he was lucky I didn't leave sooner. And then I walked away. The echo of my heels on the polished wood floors was the last sound in the room. Dean didn't follow. He didn't call out. He sat in the silence he'd spent years enforcing. Now it was his, heavy, endless. Mine had become fuel. His had become sentence. Outside, the city kept moving. Horns, voices, a breeze warm enough to soften the afternoon. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. I walked to my car with the calm of someone who had already won, not by destroying, but by enduring and transforming. The confrontation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, because the most devastating revenge isn't retribution. It's revelation. And now, everyone had seen exactly who he was, who I was, and who I would never be again. The letter had been sitting in my drawer for months before I finally mailed it. Not to Jack. He wouldn't read it. It wasn't even for him. It was addressed to myself, the version of me who once stood at the stove reheating dinner while her husband whispered on the phone in the next room. The woman who cried in the shower so her sobs would be muffled by the sound of water. Who second-guessed her instincts because someone told her she was too emotional. I wrote to her because she needed to hear what no one else had ever told her. That she was never the problem. That her softness was never a flaw. That surviving wasn't the same as living. And she didn't come all this way just to survive. The day I dropped the letter into the mailbox, I didn't expect to feel anything. But I did. It was small, subtle, like the sound of frost melting from a window pane. Something inside me released. I walked away slowly, letting the wind move through my coat, and thought to myself, this is what it means to be free. Not just of him. Of the version of myself I kept locked in a smaller room than he ever built around me. I sold the house, yes. But I didn't leave Lexington entirely. I moved into a small cottage on the edge of town. Brick, ivy-covered, with a front porch where I drink tea in the morning and write letters I no longer need to send. My neighbors are kind. They wave when they pass. A retired woman named Ruth brings me tomatoes from her garden. Sometimes we sit outside and talk about books and grief and the small details of life that make it beautiful again. Not flashy, just real. At school, the principal offered me a promotion, head of department. I turned it down. I wasn't done being in the classroom yet. There's something sacred about the chaos of teenagers discovering who they are through literature. I tell them to write about what hurts, what heals, what they don't understand yet, but feel growing in their chests like a second heartbeat. One of my students asked me once, "Miss Hartman, how do you know when it's time to let something go?" I looked at her and said, "When holding it begins to cost you more than losing it." The foundation has grown quietly. We don't post statistics or brag about victories, but we've helped over 200 women access legal support in situations where they were being erased financially or emotionally. We partner with therapists and social workers and financial planners, women, mostly, who understand what it means to rebuild without shouting. Every time I sit with a woman who begins her story with, "I don't think this matters," but I look her in the eye and say, "It does." Eva and I still meet once a month. We go to the same little cafe near the old courthouse. We don't talk about Jack anymore. We talk about ideas, books, her new partner, who listens when she speaks. Sometimes, silence is more powerful than any sentence. That's what I've learned. Letting go doesn't always look like forgetting. Sometimes it's just choosing not to carry someone's shadow any longer. Dean eventually stepped down from the firm. The fallout was quiet, corporate, full of polite phrasing like internal restructuring and leadership transition, but the message was clear. The empire Jack and Dean built on secrecy and superiority had eroded. Not with fire, with facts. Not with rage. With restraint. I didn't attend the final shareholder meeting. I didn't need to be there to watch him leave. Some battles are won simply by walking away from the battlefield while the other side is still swinging at ghosts. I kept one thing from the garage. One single page from one of Jack's folders. It wasn't labeled, just a torn piece of notebook paper with a line written in his handwriting. "Control the narrative or lose the plot." I folded it in half and tucked it into the back of my newest journal, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He believed stories were weapons. I believe they're windows. That's the difference between people who manipulate and people who heal. One builds cages, the other opens doors. Last week I went to the coast. Same place where I'd retreated after selling the house. This time, I didn't bring files or journals or anything that needed resolution. I just brought myself. A book. A blanket. A quiet sense of peace that didn't demand to be declared. I sat on a bench facing the water and watched a young woman and her daughter play near the tide. They laughed. The little girl ran ahead, turned back, and called, "Wait for me, Mama." And I felt something break and mend in the same breath. I whispered, "She will." Because that's what we do now. We wait for each other. We hold space. We tell the truth, not for revenge, but for release. And we trust that silence, real, earned silence, is no longer a prison, but a prayer. So here I am, 42, a widow, a teacher, a woman who was once watched like a threat, and now watched like a guide. I didn't win by shouting louder. I won by listening deeper, by remembering who I was before the lies, by becoming a story no one else could rewrite. And that's the thing about truth. It doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be spoken, once clearly, by someone who finally knows their own voice.